dependent, he says. And then through a series of private victories, we become independent. And then through a series of public victories, we become interdependent. He was wise in that he added a seventh habit in his first conceptualization of this that is called sharpen the saw. And what he said is that if you don't have that habit of resilience, you will not have the energy to be able to have success with the other 6 habits. Now, the way he came up with these habits, by the way, was not just out of his head. He studied the success literature for the last 200 years, and he found out that successful people practice these habits. Now, there was something missing in his conceptualization, though, he found after he did it. And so he wrote in 2004 the 8th habit. And he said the 8th habit adds depth to this model. The 8th habit being find your voice and inspire others to find theirs. That is the educator's habit, in my opinion. Find your voice and inspire others to find theirs. I really hope it's true that you work in a place that celebrates all of this. I hope that you feel when you go to work that that is a place where I can sharpen my saw. We do work hard together to sharpen our collective saw, if you will. When I was in state government, it was hard to do that, you know. When you work in a bureaucracy, a big bureaucracy, it's hard to kind of keep people psyched up. The bureaucracies tend to mute people's enthusiasm. Would you agree? So I said, what can I do about that? I'm going to have a staff meeting every Monday. That was a dumb time to have a staff meeting, by the way, at the end of the day on Monday, but I did. But I love to cook, so on Sunday what I would do is I'd make a batch of cookies, because I make the best chocolate chip cookies of anyone. Test me on this. I do. The key is don't let the butter get too soft. Okay? Use like a Toll House recipe. That's fine, but add oatmeal to it. Use pecans, not walnuts, and put coconut in them. And then don't overcook them. And they are the chewiest, they're just wonderful. So we celebrate birthdays every week of people who are on staff. That was fun. We'd make fun of them as they got older, sing louder. The other thing I did is I said to them, you know, I can't give you a raise because you work in state government. But I can give you, and I'd pull out my bag of candy, and I'd pull out a bag of Raisinets. I can't give you a raise, but I can give you Raisinets. And so what I did is I went alphabetically through my staff to force myself to think something good about all of my staff because they weren't all my friends, you know. And at each staff meeting, I would recognize the next person on the alphabetical list in a very specific way about what they had done well. Now, the big-time state bureaucrats who worked for me, and I was one of them too, it's very easy to really take this seriously, that you're the state director and you work in state government. At first went, this is so corny, it's so stupid. After about 2 weeks, guess what happened? They all began to say some other specific things about the person who was being recognized that day. And what it built was a collaborative spirit in our unit that really helped us to do a lot together. So you can do this easily. You know, pick your passion and go for it. And you could make an interdependent unit that really does work really well. One last thing about this model that I think is important for this story. Covey says that if you're independent and you're trying to deal with a person who is dependent, you cannot achieve interdependence. This is a very important lesson, I think, for all of us who deal with kids who are at risk, especially those with disabilities, because they've got parents. And those parents are often kept dependent by the system. And when they try to become independent, then the system says, well, I don't know if we want that. The very best parent advocate I've ever met said that decisions that are best made for kids with disabilities are 50% school, 50% parents. And it doesn't matter how many parents are in the room and how many school people are in the room. There could be 85 school people, one parent. The decision is still 50-50 if you're going to make the best decision. That's truly independent to independent. Do you get my point? So that's what we have to do, is help people to find their voice as we find our own. Okay. Michael Fullen is a person who many of you know, I hope, in this room. If you don't know his work, find out about his work. He wrote this book in 1993, and it was called Change Forces, and it really did revolutionize the way people thought about educational change. I like this point right here. Lesson 5 says, individualism and collectivism must have equal power. There are no one-sided solutions to isolation and groupthink. And I believe he's really correct about that. It's interesting to me that the researchers who are dealing with RTI are all coming to a conclusion that the word and has to be in your solution, not the word or. So it's not individualism or collectivism, notice. It's individualism and collectivism. Notice that it's neither centralization nor decentralization that works. It's a combination of both that work. Keep that point in mind. In 1999, he wrote the sequel to the first book called Change Forces, the sequel. He talked about all of these seemingly soft things that we've been talking about, emotional intelligence and collaborative cultures and moral purpose and attacking incoherence. He also said there's no single solution. Craft your own theories of action and actions by being a critical consumer. And that makes sense. Use data to prove whether or not it works. That's the issue. Now, when he wrote this book, he really did celebrate this old African proverb. And would you agree that this is true? That it takes a whole village to raise a child? I mean, it really does. And those of you who live in smaller places who are here today or are off in the Ethernet, those folks, I think, who live in smaller places would agree that that's where it really is still happening, right? It's harder if you live in Toronto. It's harder if you live in Denver, Colorado, to do this. But it's easier to do this in a smaller community. Many of you remember growing up where that was more likely true, right? People took care of each other and looked out for one another. That was the point. We've lost some of that as we've gone into the 21st century. The beauty of the internet has to be kind of compared to what it's doing to us. Because Google believes that dealing with the internet and dealing with what we can get in terms of resources on it is an individual activity, not a social activity. And they've built all of their model around that notion. So what do? We're all just kind of have our noses right on our laptops, right? We're all busy tweeting and texting and doing all the things we do. I am old. I'm not going to tweet. I've decided that's when I'm going to put my foot down about that. But I cannot get a hold of my 30-year-old daughter who I love, and she loves me, if I call her. But if I text her, she immediately responds. So I've learned that lesson. But anyway, that's really a true point. Now, here's something that the head of the Department of Health in Utah gave me that's a little play on that last statement. Do you know the answer to that question? One. Just one. Billy in the third grade. You all can think of this, who I'm talking about here, right? So that was the point that he was trying to make. But, I think Dr. Martin Luther King said this even better than that, about this whole thing about collaborative cultures and emotional intelligence and moral purpose. When he said that we're really not going to get integration through law. The only way we're going to get true integration is when neighbors get together and voluntarily comply about unenforceable obligations. When people's hearts are touched. The beauty of the Canadian way of educating kids is that you are not doing it based on a prescriptive federal mandate. So what I've seen in Canada as I've traveled around this great country are communities that really have been touched at the heart level and are doing wonderful things for all the students that they have. By the way, there's one little downside to what you're doing, and that is that in other places I see that it's not happening so well. Because the communities have a little more power to decide whether or not they'll educate and where they'll educate kids. But still, this point is perfectly taken, I think. We were asked in Utah a few years ago to give our best shot at what this definition of inclusion might be. And I want you to notice that we're not saying that it's a place. The mistake being made by a lot of people in the world about inclusion is that we've won once kids are placed in the general ed classroom. Are you kidding? Why is that? We've only won if they end up being adults who have more skills as a result of being placed in the general classroom. That's the point, right? So we said that inclusion is a shared value. That's the issue. So there's a principle for you. Creating a single system of education that ensures that all kids will be successful adults. And that was our mission statement for what we do with kids with disabilities in the state of Utah, is that they would all become citizens who would be caring, competent, and contributing citizens. All right, moving on. Fullen in 2003 finished his trilogy called Change Forces, and he said in lesson number 3, changing context is the focus, which is the whole purpose for this keynote, to talk about this context called RTI. Here's one way of looking at context. Fullen says in his book, here's what we've got to do. We've got to close the gap and raise the bar with a vengeance. Now, it's smart that he says both of those things because I know how to close the achievement gap in a bad way. Quit spending money on the kids who are achieving at a high level. If you do that, their achievement will be muted. And if you can keep the achievement of the at-risk kids about the same, you've closed the gap, haven't you? That's not what we want. So raising the bar and closing the gap makes some sense. In fact, I think this is the one time I disagreed with Fullen. I think a better model is closing the gap between where kids are and what the standard is. It's a criterion reference thing we're trying to do. Let's close that gap in terms of all of these kids. Now, here's another way of looking at this idea of context. Fullen quotes John Hattie, who wrote a great book called Visual Learning. That is a wonderful piece of work where he says these are the critical change agents. This is what we've got to do and commit to be able to have success with all kids. So notice that there is knowledge and skills and a plan of action and strategies to overcome setbacks and confidence and social and environmental support and freedom, control, and choice. All of that's got to be in place if we're going to have success. It's another way of looking at context. Another way of looking at context is from Fullen's book, All Systems Go, and he says that these are the 9 issues that you've got to pay attention to simultaneously. I'm starting to use these 9, by the way, about when I'm helping school districts wherever I work in a deep way to get them to really pay attention to this, because here's where the research is kind of focusing and coming to a point. The research is saying that if you do things in a piecemeal way, in a pilot kind of a way, you don't have very much of a chance to make systems change. You can help the pilot sites, but you're not going to make systems change. If you want to make systems change, you've got to do systems change. You've got to go for it. All systems go, all levels at the same time. And that's the point that is being made by Fullen. Nice and conceptual. Let's get a little more practical about this. I'm quoting myself here. This is called egotistical behavior. Quoting myself. The phrase I hate the most in education and in life is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. When you say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, does that mean it's working? Doesn't that only mean that it's not broken? My wife is from the state of Kansas. All of her relatives are farmers. I've been on a lot of farms and looked at a lot of tractors. How many of you have seen a tractor in action? A lot of farmers keep their tractor in good shape and it works just fine. Other farmers that I've met have tractors that have baling wire around the engine block and more duct tape on that thing than you can possibly imagine to try to keep it together. And it takes them a long time to get through their field. They have the front wheels, that wobble a little to go through the furrows, but these are like really wobbling. And so when they've gotten off the tractor, they've said, so why don't you fix that thing so that it works better so you don't have to spend so much time in the field? You just don't understand, Steve. You're a city boy. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think that makes no sense today. This makes sense. If it works, don't break it. But if it doesn't work, break the sucker. Does that make sense? We don't have time. Most kids don't have more than one chance at the 3rd grade. Here's another way of looking at context, a little more practical. This idea is one that comes from South Dakota, from Larry Brentro and his colleagues. It's the circle of courage. This circle of courage is based on these 4 wonderful principles. Larry taught me a couple of years ago that the reason why belonging is on that side of that Indian symbol is because that's where the sun rises. That's the most important of the 4 values that you've got to base your service to kids on. Kids have to feel a sense of belonging. I want you to think about your school systems now. And I want you to think about middle school and high school especially. Do kids have to achieve in order to feel a sense of belonging where you live? Or is it true that all kids feel a sense of belonging so that they have the strength to achieve? If your schools operate in the latter way, then you're closer to this RTI revolution. If your schools operate in the former way, where you have to achieve in order to feel a sense of belonging, then you're farther away. Does that make sense? So that sense of belonging that kids have to feel so that they can have the strength to master, they can have the strength to become independent. What I love about this is that in the United States and also in Canada, the indigenous populations have done a beautiful job of teaching their children, while you're becoming independent, show your generosity. That's called interdependence.